I give the call to the member for Dawson.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I rise to speak, of course, on the Automotive Transformation Scheme Amendment Bill 2014, which is a prime example of the Liberal National Government making a sound economic decision to rein in another wasteful spending measure by the previous Labor government. Now, the Liberal National Coalition first announced the savings to be made from amendments that are in this bill in 2011 and took this commitment to the 2013 election. This is a substantial and economically sound commitment which will deliver substantial savings of $900 million. It will be achieved by reducing the assistance available under the Automotive Transformation Scheme over the next 3 years, saving $500 million and closing the scheme altogether from the 1st of January 2018, saving another $400 million. That scheme will close altogether, Mr Deputy Speaker, because there will no longer be an automotive industry in this country to transform. Though it will undoubtedly be a sad day for many when the last Australian manufactured vehicle rolls off the production line, it comes down to the difference between economic reality versus romantic notions. And when it comes down to the question of who you want in charge of the nation's purse strings, there is no doubt that it's the realists, the economic realists, rather than the romantics, who will make the right decisions for the nation and for the taxpayer. Mr Deputy Speaker, there's been long been a romantic notion that we can continue to build cars in this country. It's kind of the romantic notion which underpins that old Aussie, so we thought, car commercial with the slogan, "We love football, meat pies, kangaroos and Holden cars." But that was a jingle from 1976 which claimed to capture what it meant to be Australian. Interestingly enough, that little ditty is about Australian as the car industry actually is. It's not Australian at all. It was actually a rehash of an American Chevrolet commercial, and the original lyrics were, "We love baseball, hot dogs, apple pie and Chevrolet." And this is the kind of romantic notion which flourished in the hearts and minds of Labor politicians who relentlessly continued to throw good money after bad in their attempts to prop up an industry whose time was past. In 2012 and 2013, when car manufacturers cried out for more money, it was Labor who was giving it away like the money was going out of fashion. They gave $34 million to Ford, they gave $29 million to Toyota and a massive $215 million to Holden. This was on top of billions of dollars in other assistance, such as a $2.5 billion under the Automotive Transformation Scheme, which was scheduled to run from 2011 to 2020. Remember that one? You know, former Prime Minister Julia Gillard saying that we'd save the car industry, have Ford continue going until 2020. Short memories those have on the opposite side, Mr Deputy Speaker, because it was under their watch, under their reign, with their money on the table, that actually Ford decided it would leave. They had $1.3 billion under the Green Car Innovation Fund and $35 million, partly federal, partly state, for the Automotive New Markets Initiative. That figure of $35 million was then increased to $47 million when Ford announced it would stop manufacturing in Australia in 2016. This is millions upon billions, Mr Deputy Speaker, for an industry which has become used to such assistance, an industry sadly out of touch with economic reality and out of touch with Australian consumers. In fact, the automotive manufacturing industry in Australia is one of the most heavily subsidised industries in this country. The Productivity Commission inquiry report into Australia's automotive manufacturing industry, released in March this year, stated about $30 billion was provided to the automotive manufacturing industry between 1997 and 2012. Now, during that period, there were 5.186 million vehicles manufactured in Australia. 5,186,765 vehicles, to be precise. That equates to $5,784 per vehicle of government support or taxpayer dollars during that period. In August 2008, the Productivity Commission Chair Gary Banks warned that on the current assistance levels, the subsidy levels, each job saved, or in inverted commas saved, in the car industry actually came at a cost to the taxpayer of $30,000 a year. $30,000 a year for those jobs. This massive taxpayer-funded subsidy was described by the Australian's editor-at-large, the esteemed Paul Kelly, as, quote, one of the epic failures in public subsidy in Australia's history, end quote. And yet, even with all that assistance, the industry could not survive in a highly competitive global market. Now, Holden recently announced its worst loss ever, a $553.8 million loss for the calendar year 2013, taking its total losses to about $1 billion for the past 8 years. Ford recently announced the third worst loss ever, a $267 million loss, taking its total losses to $1.1 billion for the last 8 years. Some other economic realities are outlined very clearly in a Productivity Commission inquiry report. Reality number one, Mr Deputy Speaker, the report states that most analysts believe an assembly plant should produce at least 200,000 to 300,000 vehicles each year to actually be cost competitive. Now, in 2012, Toyota produced just over 100,000 vehicles, Holden just over 80,000, Ford less than 40,000. Reality number two, due to strong competition, motor vehicle producers are increasingly moving to large-scale plants in low-cost locations where there's growing demand, places like Brazil, China, India and Thailand. Higher-cost plants in the US and some parts of Europe, as well as Australia, have closed or are closing. There has been another romantic notion at play on the subject of cars, and that it's Aussies like to drive Aussie-manufactured cars, but that's actually not the case. The reality of what car consumers want can be seen in everyday car parks and every road across this country. We like diversity, we like value for money, we don't give a hoot where it comes from, and that's the reality. Though Labor failed to comprehend the economic realities afflicting the car industry, others in the wider community certainly could. And Deloitte Australia's senior economic advisor Henry Ergas put it best when he said in The Age, January 13, 2012, taxpayers have every right to wonder whether they're getting value for that money. We don't have any comprehensive assessment of the effectiveness of that assistance. He said the car-making industry in Australia remained hooked on the public purse. He said this is an industry that has always had dependence on government assistance. It was created by government assistance and survived thanks to it. And here's a quote from the ANZ Bank industrial economist Julie Toth, who saw the writing on the wall way back in 2008. And she said in the Sydney Morning Herald, November 10, 2008, with regard to the big three, Ford, Holden and Toyota, no matter how generous the Australian government is to our three remaining local car makers, the main game for them is not in Australia. Huge losses, liability, declining sales and other problems in the US and elsewhere will be quite rightly foremost in their attentions of their respective parent companies. Even one of their own on the opposite side, former Labor leader Mark Latham, criticised the plan to spend billions of dollars. He said in the Financial Review of the 7th of November last year, as a Victorian power broker, Senator Kim Carr relies heavily on the support of Australian Manufacturer Workers Union. Carr's strategy was to pay huge amounts of public money to industries such as car manufacturing to prop up the union's membership coverage and consequently its influence within the ALP. Well, if that is correct, what a disgraceful use of taxpayer dollars by the former Minister, Kim Carr. It would be nice to think that governments have these big buckets of money to throw at any individual, any business or any industry that faces tough times, Mr Deputy Speaker. And the actions of the former Gillard-Rudd Labor government would make you believe that actually that is the case, that government does have this big bucket of money. And I know that there's thousands of mining and construction workers, businesses and service industries in my electorate of Dawson and all throughout central Queensland and North Queensland that also wish that was the case. Those workers and businesses are dealing with harsh economic realities, and the realities are hitting home at an escalating pace. Today, we've just heard the closure of the Isaac Plains mine, which will cost 300 jobs. Last week, BMA announced they were cutting 700 jobs from their mining operations throughout the Bowen Basin. That's a loss of 1,000 jobs within a week. 1,000 jobs within a week. In fact, over the past 2 years, there are estimates of about 12,000 jobs and up that have been lost in that sector. No one has come along, though. No one has come along with a big fat chequebook in order to save them. Now, you could imagine the response from those opposite, and particularly my friends in inverted commas in the Greens, if, for example, the BMA cried out to the federal government for an industry assistance package, or if Tees jumped up and down and put their hand out for a fistful of dollars. Well, we've got this clown over here, Mr Deputy Speaker, going on about fossil fuel subsidies. Fossil fuel subsidies. I've got to say, how about those subsidies that we actually give to those green groups? We should cut them too. The tax deductibility status that they get to destroy jobs in the mining sector. I mean, there is no such thing as these fossil fuel subsidies they're carrying on about. The fact is, it's a diesel fuel rebate that's actually given to them because the fuel they use is for off-road purposes. When the diesel fuel tax was brought in for on-road usage of that product. So let's stop the nonsense, and we could do that by simply not listening to the Greens so much. Now, you can imagine that response if the federal government suddenly handed over a large cheque to a group like BMA. That suggestion would be laughable and it wouldn't be considered. And why? Because once again, it comes down to these economic realities rather than romantic notions. The time of the Labor-free lunch is past. The government's dealing with the debt that we're left with and the deficit disaster we're left with and getting the country back on track. Even car companies involved understand those economic realities. GM Holden boss Mike Devereaux said in December last year, as painful as it is to say, building cars in this country is just not sustainable. Ford President Bob Graziano said, our costs are double that of Europe and nearly 4 times Ford in Asia. The business case simply did not stack up, leading us to the conclusion that manufacturing is not viable for Ford in Australia in the long term. Toyota Australia President and Chief Executive Officer Max Yasuda said, we did everything that we could to transform a business. But the reality is there are too many factors beyond our control that make it unviable to build cars in Australia. Although the company has made profits in the past, our manufacturing operations have continued to be at loss-making despite our best efforts. The heads of those companies, General Motors Holden, Ford Australia and Toyota Australia, also made public statements that the level of government assistance did not influence their decision to close. Now, there are voices that are raised to oppose these savings measures by those opposite. There might even be claims that cutting this scheme from $2.5 billion to $1.6 billion over the next 3 years will hasten the demise of the car industry. Now, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've got to say it would be absolutely reckless of any individual in this place to spend an extra dollar of that $900 million we are trying to pull back, when these companies have publicly announced they are leaving this country. We would essentially be piping taxpayer dollars, the dollars out of the pockets of mums and dads around this country, into the coffers of foreign multinationals for no long-term gain whatsoever. And that's what the Labor Party want us to do today. That is what the Labor Party want us to do. Well, shame on them, wanting to rip taxpayer dollars out of the pockets of mums and dads and put it into foreign multinational coffers. Shame on them. But there is still assistance available to assist workers and businesses through the transformation of the car industry. There's $700 million available in the Automotive Transformation Assistance Scheme, available to the industry over the next 4 years. Other measures which will assist those who will be affected by the end of the automotive manufacturing in this country are included in the $155 million growth fund announced by the Prime Minister and Industry Minister on April 30 last year. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, the assistance is there as a transition takes place. The economic reality is that this transition away from automotive manufacturing in this country must take place. It doesn't spell the end of manufacturing in this country. There are also other areas of opportunity. Food and agribusiness, mining technology and services, particularly in my area, in Dawson, in North Queensland. And there are opportunities which were highlighted in the recent Green Paper on developing Northern Australia. It's a decision that's been made by economic realists in this room that will deliver $900 billion back to the budget bottom line. I support this bill, Mr Deputy Speaker.